Colonial Period, 1620 to 1750. The colonial period, Native Americans, the first inhabitants of the continent, did not develop anything we can call literature. Their stories and poems were spread orally, which means the American literary history begins with the age of colonialism. Moreover, it was the era of colonizing the continent, since only the English explored and claimed the territories. The beginnings of the American literature are more or less connected, also with French, Spanish, or Dutch literatures as well. The first writers brought mainly English ideas and ways of writing, which means early American literature is based on the literature of England. As years passed and literary theory developed, the writers who adopted the English style are now sometimes called palefaces. Their poetry is sometimes referred to as folk poetry. On the other hand, there were authors who explored new topics and helped shape America's own literary tradition. Those are called redskins. Their poetry is referred to as raw poetry. Religion played an important part in the writers' lives. Many writings of the period were sermons and theological books. The fact that pilgrims landed in the Massachusetts Bay in 1620 had immense influence of the culture of the newly developing colonial system. The topics common in the early periods were connected with the issues of living in a new land, like agriculture, explorations, and relations with the native people, and traveling like travelogues and journals. Their notable authors and their works. John Smith, 1580 to 1631, is considered to be the first American writer. He was an explorer and colonist. He helped found Jamestown in 1607. His A True Relation of Virginia is said to be the first American book written in English. It describes the problem colonizing the area. William Bradford, 1590 to 1657, was a Puritan writer who described life in the early English settlement. His books of Plymouth Plantation is full of religious topics and depictions of the difficult life in the colony. Anne Bradstreet, 1612 to 1672, wrote lyrical and personal poetry. She is the author to My Dear and Loving Husband. Revolutionary Period, 1765 to 1790. The Revolutionary Period refers to writings that are politically motivated, either in support of American patriotism and independence or relating to Constitution. The writers became more politically anti-British and revolutionary-oriented. Rationalism and Enlightenment rebelled. Essays, speeches, and pamphlets became more important. The Puritans' religious poetry fell out of favor, as man was not considered natural sinful any longer. There are notable authors and their works. First, Benjamin Franklin, 1706 to 1790, is one of the most important figures of the period. He can be described as what we call a Renaissance man, a person of many skills. He was a politician, scientist, philosopher, publisher, humorist, inventor, and writer. The way to wealth gave the advice how to become successful. Hard work and common sense are very important. Autobiography, Franklin writes about his life, his success and failures, and individualism. Second one is Thomas Paine, 1737 to 1809. Was an English-born essayist and pamphleteer. His pamphlet is Common Sense. He's a sharp critique of the colonial system and explains why the Americans should rise against the English. And the third one is the John Hector St. John, 1735 to 1830, was a French-American writer, one of the father of the American novel. His epistolary novel, Letters from an American Farmer, deals with the differences between life in Europe and in America. Lastly, Thomas Jefferson, 1743 to 1826, was an architect, essayist, lawyer, politician, and later became the third president of the United States of America. His greatest contribution to the history of America is that he is the main author of the Declaration of Independence, which was adopted by the Continental Congress of the 4th of July in 1776 during the War of Independence.
The Nationalist Period occurred between the years 1775 to 1828, which was first sparked by the American Revolution. Due to the revolution and the formation of what is now known as the United States of America, people were at the peak of patriotism and having nationalistic views. People wanted to be as American as possible after final breaking out of the British rule. During this time, a body of distinctive American literature began to form, inspired by the American Revolution, could only be referred to as extremely nationalist and extremely American. The texts, however, were all still written in English style, but the setting, themes, and characters were all American. The literature written then was like a small window showing the world what it was like to live and be American. The period that saw the beginnings of a literature that could be truly identified as an American. The settings, themes, and character were authentically American. Poets of this time wrote poetry that was relatively independent of English precursor. Three of the most recognized writers of these times are Washington Irving, James Fenimore Cooper, and Edgar Allan Poe. Here are the works and notable authors. The Contrast, written in 1787 by Royal Tyler, is an American play in the tradition of the English Restoration comedies of the 17th century. It takes its cues from Sheridan's The School for Scandal, a British comedy of manners that had revived the tradition a decade before. Royal uses the form to satirize Americans who follow British fashions and indulge in British vices. Thus, the play is often concerned with portraying the contrast between the European and the American culture. Next would be William Hill and his works The Power of Sympathy, or it is called The Triumph of Nature. It is written in 1789, is an 18th century American sentimental novel written in epistolary form by William Hill Brown, and is widely considered to be the first American novel. The Power of Sympathy was Brown's first novel. The characters indulge. This character's struggle illustrate the dangers of seduction and the pitfalls of giving into one's fashion while advocating the moral education of women, and the use of national thinking as ways to prevent the consequences of such actions. Next would be Washington Irving and his work The Legend of Sleepy Hollow is a Gothic story by American author Washington Irving, contained in his collection of 34 essays and short stories titled The Sketch Book of Geoffrey Crayon Gent, written while Irving was living abroad in Birmingham, England. This Legend of Sleepy Hollow was first published in 1819 along with Irving's companion piece Rip Van Winkle. The Legend of Sleepy Hollow is among the earliest examples of American fiction with enduring popularity, especially during Halloween, between of a character known as the Headless Horseman, believed to be a Hessian soldier who was decapitated by a cannonball in a battle. And next would Edgar Allan Poe and his work The Raven. This is a narrative poem by American writer, yours truly, Edgar Allan Poe, first published in January 1845. The poem is often noted for its musicality, style, language, and supernatural atmosphere. It tells of a talking raven mysteriously visit to a distraught lover, tracing the man's slow descent into madness. Romanticism and transcendental movements. It occurs in 18,000 to 1880. It is a movement of the 19th century where our action against the 18th century age of enlightenment emphasis on science and rationalism as way of discovering truth. The writers associated with these movements advocated the right of individuals to dissent and to engage in civil disobedience. They also believed that government may not interfere with freedom of expression. The period of Romanticism represented a revolt against classicism and its values such as reason and form. The writings were less political and religious. The topics were mostly American, and the writers stressed imagination, nature, and individualism. Transcendentalism is a movement of authors concentrated in Boston. They were inspired by nature, who spent time alone and relied on themselves. Also, they stressed the role of intuition, and God was omnipresent for them. So here's the notable works and author. First was William Wills Brown, and his work Clotho. The book was first published in the United States in 1864 as Clotho, A Tale of Southern States. It was the first novel written by an African American, but it was published in the United States after Harriet E. Wilson's Arnig. It is a melodramatic tale of three generations of black women who struggle with the construction of slaveries, miscegenation, and concubination. Next is Arnig, or Sketches from the Life of a Pre-Black and Two-Story White House by Harriet E. Wilson. Next, author was Ralph Waldo Emerson, whose went by his middle name. Waldo was an American essayist, lecturer, philosopher, abolitionist, and poet who led the transcendentalist movement of the mid-19th century. He was seen as a champion of individualism and a critic of the countervailing pressures of societies, and his ideology was disseminated through dozens of published essays and more than 1,500 public lectures across the United States. Lastly was Walt Whitman, and his work of Leaves of Grass is a poetry collection by American poet Walt Whitman. Though it was first published in 1855, Whitman spent most of the professional life writing and rewriting Leaves of Grass, revising it multiple times until his death.
The Realistic Period. Just as in Europe, the period of the Romanticism was followed by the period of Realism. Writers left behind the styles and topics adopted by the previous generation and rather concentrated in describing life as it was negative typical for the period. As a result of American Civil War, Reconstruction, and the age of industrialism, American ideals and self-awareness changed in profound ways, and American literature responded. It was the era of industrialization and immigration. Determinism was a major power theme of the age. Certain romantic nations of the American Renaissance were replaced by realistic descriptions of American life. Unlike romantic fiction, realistic fiction aims to represent life as it really is and make the reader believe the characters actually might exist and the situations might actually happen. Here are the notable authors in Realistic Period and their works. First is Mark Twain. In the year 1815 to 1910, he was known as a great American novelist, short story writer, and humorist. His most famous novels are probably The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, a book describing the life of a problem boy, and The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn in 1884, which concentrates on Tom Sawyer's friend Huck. The book criticizes slavery and tries to describe the world through the eyes of a naive, uncivilized, yet honest boy. Another is The Prince and the Pauper, which tells the story of a poor boy who changes places with Prince Edward, Henryville's son. Another author is Henry James, in the year 1843 to 1916, who became a British citizen, wrote psychological novels, and compared different cultures. His most famous novels includes What Mysie Knew, a novel about an unloved child, and The Turnip Screw, a ghost story novella, or Daisy Miller. Lastly is Harriet Beecher Stowe in 1811 to 1896. It is another socially critical writer of the period. She is the author of Uncle Tom's Cabin, where she fought against slavery. The Naturalist Period in the year 1900s to 1914. The 1890s saw the rise of naturalism, an extreme form of realism coined by Emile Zola. This relatively short period is defined by its insistence on recreating life as life really is, even more so than the realists had been doing in the decades before. Writers portrayed people in extreme situations and described their real behavior. Most books are full of dirty environment, poor neighborhoods, prostitutes, drunks, crime, and illiteracy. Here are the notable authors and their works. Stephen Crane. In the year 1871 to 1900s, he wrote Maggie, a girl of the streets about a New York prostitute. Next is Jock London in the year 1876 to 1916. He is famous for his books taking place in Alaska during Gold Rush. He is the author of White Fang or Call of the Wild. It is about a novel of a dog whose master is killed by Indians and which becomes a leader of a wolf pack. Third is Theodore Dreiser. In the year 1871 to 1945, he wrote Sister Carrie and an American Tragedy in the year 1925, which is a critic of the idea of the American dream. Lastly is Upton Sinclair. In the year 1878 to 1968, he had his best-known book, The Jungle, which is a story of immigrants from Poland and Lithuania living in Chicago and working in terrible conditions and in a slaughterhouse.
The Modern Period, from 1914 to 1939. Since the dawn of the 20th century, writers were looking for new ways of writing and new topics. The writings expressed their feelings about living in a modern age. Some wrote positively and some wrote negatively. Their style became more complicated and experiments were quite common. Many movements appeared together. They might be called modernism. Modern period is the second most influential and artistically rich age of American writing. Many writers were influenced by World War I and the disillusionment that followed, especially the expert traits of the lost generation. Furthermore, the Great Depression and the New Deal resulted in some of America's greatest social issue writing. Works in this period reflect the changing of social, political, and cultural climate, and are diverse, experimental, and non-traditional. This period brought us perhaps our best writers. The authors during this period raised all the great questions in life, but offered no answers. Notable authors and their works. First, Ezra Pound. He was one of the most influential poets of the 20th century. He was involved in pioneering new styles and movements, called Imagism, which means words provoke pictures in the reader's mind, or vorticism. His most important work is called Cantos. T.S. Eliot. He lived in Britain and wrote The Wasteland, which is a very complicated modernist poem. Ernest Hemingway. He's probably the most famous representative of the lost generation. It's a term invented by Gertrude Stein to refer to a group of writers who felt alienated to the world. His writing style is very plain, however, his stories and novels are sometimes compared to an iceberg, which means he only sees 1/8 and the rest is hidden. His novelette, The Old Man and the Sea, in 1952, earned him the Nobel Prize for the literature. Carl Sandburg. He was optimistic about America's future. He expressed his passion for the rhythm of a modern city in his Chicago poems. F. Scott Fitzgerald. He's well known for The Great Gatsby. It's a book shows the negative aspects of high society in the Roaring Twenties. And The Curious Case of Benjamin Button, which is a short story about a man suffering from reverse aging. Both of these books are adapted into movies. The Great Gatsby was portrayed by Leonardo DiCaprio and Tobey Maguire. On the other hand, The Curious Case of Benjamin Button, which is one of my favorite movies of all time, was portrayed by Brad Pitt. Contemporary period, from 1939 to present. This period includes an abundance of important American literary figures spanning from World War II into the new millennium. To start off, in 1950s, a vigorous anti-establishment and anti-traditional literary movement emerged. The main writers of this movement are called beat writers. Much writing in the 1960s and 1970s were referred to as counterculture writing. They continue the literary ideals of the beat movement, but in a more extreme and fevered manner. African American literature became more prominent as their struggle for human rights intensified. They followed the so-called Harlem Renaissance, which is a movement of black writers from the 1920s. Jewish American literature draws inspiration from the painful experience of the Holocaust, but also from the Jewish spirit, traditions, and humor. Asian American and Latin American also appeared. More movements appeared like Beat Generation, hippies, ethnic writers like African American, Asian, Latin American, Native American, and Jewish. They became more involved, and some of the authors may be called postmodernist. New topics became popular, such as the revolt against the system, ethnic and racial issues. New genres flourished like comic books, fantasy novels, sci-fi, or horror stories, and American drama was going through its best times. Notable authors and their works. First, J.D. Salinger. He wrote The Catcher in the Rye in 1951. It's a short novel about a young man leaving his university studies, disgusted with people around him. Toni Morrison. She is famous for her novel The Bluest Eye in 1970. It's about a black girl who is raped by her father and becomes pregnant with him. The book criticizes black girls' pursuit of the ideal of beauty embodied by white girls. Bernard Malamud. He is the author of The Fixer. It's a book about Jews experiencing anti-Semitism in Ukraine. And Scott Momaday. He is probably the best-known Native American writer. He wrote The House Made of Thorn. It's a non-linear novel about an Indian man who belongs neither to his tribe nor to the majority. New genres have become more popular in the past decades. As for sci-fi, George R.R. Martin is the author of A Song of Ice and Fire, a series of fantasy books beginning with the best-selling A Game of Thrones. Stephen King. He's the best example of modern horror fiction. His books The Dreamcatcher, Carrie, Salem's Lot, It, Misery, or The Dark Humor became hits. Teen fiction has become very popular in the past few years. The Maze Runner by James Dashner in 1972 being an example of a contemporary bestseller. It was also adapted into a movie trilogy entitled The Maze Runner, The Scourge Trials, and The Death Cure.